No assassin carries love poetry, and certainly no ordinary admirer hides under the bed to stalk the object of his affection as she disrobes. Pierre de Chastelard twisted his admiration into a morbid invasion of Mary Queen of Scots' private chambers. He believed this reckless insanity was proof of his love, but in reality it was the act of a predator disguised as a poet, forcing Scotland's most powerful woman to scream in absolute terror. Facing the executioner's axe, the poet arrogantly refused to confess to God, clutching a book of verse and directing his final words to the cruel woman who had just signed his death warrant. It remains one of the most bizarre deaths in royal history, as chillingly romantic as it was heartbreakingly cruel. Pierre's blood was spilled not for political intrigue, but for the mad delusion that the queen belonged to him. Pierre de Chastelard was born in 1540 in the Dauphiné region of southeastern France. This is crucial context. Dauphiné was a land of jagged mountains and hard men, a place that bred warriors. If you look at his family tree, you see steel and honor. He was the grandson, some sources suggest the grandnephew, of the Chevalier de Bayard. For those unfamiliar with the pantheon of French heroes, Pierre Terray, the Chevalier de Bayard, was the Captain America of the Renaissance. He was known throughout Christendom as Le Chevalier, sans peur et sans reproche, the knight without fear and without reproach. He was the absolute gold standard of masculine virtue. Young Chastelard grows up in this massive, suffocating shadow. He is expected to be a titan of war, and initially he tries to fulfill this destiny. Historical records show he served as a page to the Constable Montmorency, one of the most powerful military figures in France. He later joined the household of the Marshal d'Anville, Henri de Montmorency. These were not places for soft men. These were the war rooms of France. Chastelard was trained to hold a heavy lance, to ride a war horse, and to kill men in close quarters. But there was a fracture in Chastelard's identity. While his hands held the sword, his soul was in the library. During the late 1550s, France was undergoing a cultural revolution. A group of poets known as La Pléiade was changing the way people thought about love and death. Their leader was Pierre de Ronsard, the Prince of Poets. Ronsard taught a dangerous philosophy to impressionable young men, that life is short, beauty fades, and the only thing that matters is passion. Intense, consuming, tragic passion. Chastelard becomes Ronsard's student. He does not just read the poetry, he metabolizes it. He begins to view the world through a filter of romantic melancholy. He rejects the gritty reality of the soldier for the elevated reality of the lover. He begins to believe that dying for love is nobler than dying for a king. He is a man looking for a story to star in. While Chastelard is dreaming of romance in France, the object of his future obsession is facing a harsh new reality. The year is 1561. Europe is a powder keg. On one side, the Protestant Reformation is tearing through the continent like wildfire, challenging the authority of the Pope. On the other, the Catholic Church is digging in its heels, and caught in the absolute center of this storm is Mary Stuart, Mary, Queen of Scots. She is 18 years old. She is a widow, having lost her husband, King Francis II of France. She has just returned to Scotland after growing up in the glittering, sun-drenched court of the French Valois kings. We must pause to imagine the sheer scale of the culture shock she experienced. Mary leaves the Louvre and the chateau of the Loire Valley, places of silk, lute music, sophisticated flirting, and Renaissance art. She lands in Leith, Scotland in August 1561. The records tell us a thick, freezing fog covered the harbor that day. It is wet. It is gray. But the climate is the least of her problems. The political landscape is dominated by John Knox, a fiery Calvinist preacher who believes that female rulers are a curse from God and that dancing is a sin comparable to idolatry. Mary is a Catholic queen in a country that has largely turned Protestant. She is lonely. She is, to use a modern metaphor, a tropical bird trapped in a refrigerator. To survive, Mary creates a bubble. She surrounds herself with a little France, a protective circle of the four Maries, her ladies-in-waiting, musicians and poets who remind her of home. She tries to recreate the warmth of the French court within the cold stone walls of Holyrood Palace. This is the world Pierre de Chastelard walks into. Chastelard arrives in Scotland in the entourage of Monsieur de Damville, who is escorting the Queen. He represents everything Mary misses about her life in France. He is witty, he is artistic, he plays the lute, and he knows how to play the complex game of courtly romance. But here, the historian must put on the detective's hat, because there is a detail about Chastelard that does not fit the romantic narrative. While Mary is a devout Catholic, Chastelard is a Huguenot, a French Protestant. In a time when religion is war, when Catholics and Protestants are slaughtering each other across Europe, this detail is not just a footnote. It is a giant red flag. Archives suggest Chastelard had a specific patroness back in France, referred to in some letters as Madame de Curaçao. While this sounds like a generic title, historical analysis suggests it was likely a code name or a reference to Charlotte de Laval. Who was she? She was the wife of Gaspard de Coligny, the Admiral of France and the supreme leader of the Huguenot faction. We must ask the uncomfortable question: why would the wife of the militant Protestant leader be sponsoring a young poet to travel with a Catholic queen? Was Chastelard just a messenger? Or was he placed there to watch her, to find a weakness? The Protestant faction in France and Scotland was desperate to discredit Mary. They couldn't defeat her army easily, but they could defeat her character. If Mary could be painted as immoral, loose, or scandalous, her claim to the English throne, which threatened Queen Elizabeth I, would be weakened. Did Chastelard start as a spy and end as a fanatic? This is the first loose thread in the tapestry of the mad lover. When the French entourage prepares to return home, Chastelard makes a fateful decision. He stays. Or rather, he returns to Scotland after a brief trip to France, drawn back like a moth to a flame. Upon his return, a dangerous dynamic begins to form between the Queen and the poet. Mary is playing a game called courtly love. It is a medieval tradition, a safety valve for the aristocracy. In this game, a man writes a poem saying, "I am dying of desire for you." And the woman smiles and says, "That's a lovely rhyme." It is a barrier. It is a way of being intimate without being physical. It is intellectual flirting. Chastelard, however, does not understand the rules, or perhaps he chooses to ignore them. He views the poem not as a metaphor, but as a contract. Psychiatrists today might diagnose Chastelard with erotomania, also known as de Clerambault's syndrome. This is a specific delusion where a person believes a high-status individual is secretly in love with them, but cannot express it due to social constraints. Every smile Mary gives him, he interprets as a secret signal. Every polite thank you for a sonnet, he interprets as a confession of undying love. Two specific events in 1562 act as gasoline on this fire. First, the horse. Mary was a generous monarch. She gave gifts to her courtiers to buy loyalty. She gifted Chastelard a gelding. But to Chastelard's fevered mind, this wasn't just a horse. This animal had been given to Mary by her half-brother, Lord Robert Stuart. To Chastelard, receiving a personal gift from the Queen's own private stable was like receiving a wedding ring. He paraded around the Royal Mile in Edinburgh on this horse, believing he was the Queen's acknowledged favorite. Second, the dance, specifically the La Volta. Most dances of the 16th century were formal, lots of bowing, slight hand-holding, very rigid. The La Volta was different. It was the dirty dancing of the Renaissance. It was scandalous. It involved the man placing his hand firmly on the woman's corset busk, right on the torso, and using his thigh to hoist her into the air as they spun. Mary loved this dance. It was athletic and reminded her of France. She often chose Chastelard as her partner because he was French and he actually knew the steps, unlike the stiff Scottish lords. Imagine the psychology here. You are obsessed with a woman. You believe she loves you. And now publicly, in front of the whole court, you are holding her waist, feeling the warmth of her body, lifting her into the air while the music swells. For Mary, it was exercise. For Chastelard, it was a promise. He wrote her poems, not just polite verses, but steamy, desperate, blood and guts poetry. And Mary, bored in rainy Scotland and starving for intellectual stimulation, wrote back. She engaged in a poetic duel, matching his rhymes. She was having fun. She didn't realize she was feeding a starving wolf. As the winter of 1562 turned into the spring of 1563, the game was about to end. The poet was done with metaphors. He was ready to act. We leave the ballroom, where the air is thick with lute music and dangerous flirtation, and move into the shadows. Chastelard has mistaken the Queen's indulgence for a promise, and the game of courtly love is about to collide with the cold, hard reality of treason. The poet believes he is living in a romance novel, but he is about to step into a political thriller. As the candles are extinguished in Holyrood Palace, the metaphor ends and the violation begins. The tragedy of Pierre de Chastelard is not that he wasn't warned. It is that he was warned, caught, and spared, and he interpreted this mercy as an invitation. To understand the sequence of events that destroyed him, we must look at the layout of a 16th century royal palace. Holyrood House in Edinburgh was not a modern home with private locks on every door. It was a semi-public stage. The Queen's chambers were the Holy of Holies, protected by a series of antechambers, guards, and ladies-in-waiting. Access was power. On the night of February 12, 1563, the machinery of the court was winding down. The grooms of the chamber were performing their nightly ritual. They were sweeping the rooms, checking the heavy velvet drapes that covered the drafty windows, and ensuring the candles were extinguished. It was during this routine sweep that they found him. Hiding in the Queen's bedchamber, sources vary on whether he was under the bed or concealed within a wardrobe, was Chastelard. He was not there to recite poetry. He was armed with a sword and a dagger. When the guards dragged him out, the panic was immediate. But it was a silent panic. The Queen was not yet in the room. The grooms, loyal to Mary, faced a dilemma. If they raised the alarm, the whole castle would wake up. The scandal would be instantaneous. A man was found in the Queen's bedroom. In the hypercharged political atmosphere of 1563, facts didn't matter. Perception did. They informed the Queen quietly. Mary's reaction was a mixture of fury and naivety. She was 20 years old. She had grown up in France where courtly games were common. She perhaps thought this was a prank gone wrong or a moment of madness that could be hushed up. She did not want to feed the gossip mills of John Knox. So she made a decision that would haunt her She did not arrest him. She did not execute him. She scolded him. Mary ordered Chastelard to leave the court and quit Scotland immediately. It was a banishment. In her mind, she was being a benevolent ruler, sparing a foolish young man from the executioner's block. She was giving him a second chance at life. But she failed to understand the mind of a stalker. To a man suffering from erotomania, no does not mean no. It means not now. It means there are obstacles we must overcome. When Mary banished him, Chastelard likely heard, "I cannot love you here, where eyes are watching. I am sending you away to protect you because I care." He did not go to the port at Leith. He did not board a ship for France. Instead, he quietly packed his bags and followed the royal procession as it moved north, deeper into the Scottish countryside. 2 days later, on February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, the Queen's entourage crossed the chilly waters of the Firth of Forth. They were heading to Rossin Castle in Burntisland, Fife. We must pause to consider the setting. Unlike the sprawling fortress of Edinburgh or the grandeur of Holyrood, Rossin was a smaller, more intimate fortification. It was a domestic space. The security was lighter. The atmosphere was more relaxed. It was a stopover on a royal progress, a place for the Queen to rest. The irony of the date is impossible to ignore. Valentine's Day in the 16th century was already associated with the pairing of birds and lovers. For Chastelard, who lived his life according to symbols and verses, this date must have felt like a cosmic sign. He had trailed the Queen's party across the water. He knew the layout of the castle. He knew that in a smaller house, the strict separation between the public court and the private monarch would be thinner. That night, Mary retired to her chamber early. She was tired from the journey. She was attended by her ladies-in-waiting, likely Mary Seton and Mary Fleming. The rituals of undressing began. The heavy jewelry was removed. The stiff corseted gowns, the armor of queenship, were unlaced. Mary was stripped down to her shift. She was no longer the political figurehead of Scotland. She was a vulnerable young woman preparing for sleep. The candles were dim. The guards were outside the door. And then the shadow moved. Chastelard burst out from his hiding place. This time he had bypassed the grooms. He had found a way into the inner sanctum. The historical accounts of what happened next are brief but terrifying. This was not a poetic recitation. Chastelard rushed at the Queen. He attempted to embrace her. He tried to claim her, believing that if he could physically possess her, the social barriers would dissolve. It was an assault. It was the nightmare scenario of every female monarch in history, the realization that your power stops at the reach of a man's arm. Mary screamed. It was not a polite cry for help. It was a scream of terror. Her ladies-in-waiting, paralyzed by shock, saw a man with a weapon lunging at their mistress. In the next room, the Earl of Moray, James Stuart, Mary's half-brother and her chief advisor, heard the commotion. Moray was a soldier and a statesman. He did not hesitate. He kicked open the door and rushed in with the torchlight. The scene he found was chaotic. The Queen of Scots was cowering, half-naked, hysterical. Chastelard was standing there, wild-eyed, perhaps realizing too late that the script in his head did not match the reality in the room. This moment is the pivot point of the entire story. It reveals the brutal difference between Mary's emotional reaction and her brother's political calculation. Mary, traumatized and humiliated, snapped. The gentle widow vanished. She looked at her brother, pointed a shaking finger at Chastelard, and screamed a command that was recorded by the diplomats present. "Thrust your dagger into the villain." She wanted him dead instantly. She wanted the stain erased. She wanted the man who had violated her sanctuary to cease existing before he could speak a word. But the Earl of Moray did not draw his dagger. James Stuart was a Protestant. He was a cold, calculating operator who navigated the treacherous waters of Scottish politics with a steady hand. He looked at the scene. A dead French poet in the Queen's bedroom, a hysterical, undressed Queen, and no witnesses but her ladies. He realized the trap immediately. If he killed Chastelard right there, the rumors would be uncontrollable. Why did Moray kill him? Was it to silence him? Was Chastelard actually the Queen's lover and Moray caught them? Was it a crime of passion? A dead man cannot testify. A dead man cannot clear the Queen's name. No, madam, Moray reportedly said, restraining the guards who had rushed in behind him. The law must take its course. His blood would not honor you. It was a moment of supreme political discipline. Moray saved Chastelard from the Queen's wrath, not out of mercy, but out of necessity. He needed a trial. He needed a public confession. He needed the world to know that this man was an intruder, not a lover. Chastelard was tackled, shackled, and dragged out of the room. The romance was over. The investigation had begun. For the modern mind, it is hard to grasp the magnitude of this crime. In the 16th century, the Queen's body was not just a physical form, it was the embodiment of the state. To touch the monarch without permission was not just assault, it was sacrilege. The privy chamber of a European monarch was the center of political gravity. Access was strictly controlled because proximity meant power. By violating this space, Chastelard had not just broken a social rule, he had broken the divine barrier between the ruler and the subject. It was an act of chaos that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. Chastelard was hauled to the dungeons of St. Andrews. The romantic poet was now just a prisoner in the cold dark. The interrogation began immediately. We do not have the full transcripts, but we know the questions that would have been asked. They didn't care about his poetry, they cared about the plot. Who sent you? Did the Huguenots pay you? Did the English Queen know? Chastelard, to his credit, or perhaps his delusion, never implicated a conspiracy. He stuck to his story. He did it for love. He claimed he was overcome by passion. He admitted to hiding under the bed. He admitted to the intrusion. But there is a detail in the records that suggests he might have been coached, or at least emboldened by others. During his time in Scotland, he had been friendly with certain Protestant lords. Had they patted him on the back? Had they jokingly suggested he go to her? In the world of espionage, the useful idiot is the most dangerous weapon because he doesn't know he is being used. The trial was swift. There was no defense. The crime was lèse-majesté, an offense against the dignity of the sovereign. In 1563, attempting to force oneself on a queen was indistinguishable from an assassination attempt. It was treason. The verdict was death. The sentence was beheading. While Chastelard sat in his cell waiting for the axe, the damage outside was already spreading. This is where the tragedy of the man becomes the tragedy of the queen. The news of the intrusion reached John Knox within hours. The preacher did not see a victim. He saw an opportunity. Knox began to spin the narrative. He did not preach about a stalker attacking a woman. He preached about a loose court where such things were allowed to happen. He used the incident to validate his attacks on Mary's character. "What kind of life does a woman lead?" he thundered from the pulpit, "that a man feels bold enough to hide under her bed not once, but twice?" He argued that Mary's behavior, her dancing, her French manners, her frivolity, had invited the attack. In modern terms, it was classic victim blaming. But in 1563, it was a potent political argument. It suggested that Mary was not fit to rule because she could not even control her own household. The Chastelard affair became the first crack in the foundation of Mary's reign. It taught her enemies that her private life was her Achilles' heel. It set the stage for the murder of Rizzio and the disaster of Darnley. But before the history books could close on this chapter, there was one final act to be played. The stage was set in St. Andrews, the crowd was waiting, and the poet had one last verse to recite. The trap has sprung, the queen has screamed, the brother has intervened, and the mad lover is now a prisoner of the state. But for Mary's enemies, a quiet trial isn't enough. They need a spectacle. As Chastelard sits in the damp darkness of the St. Andrew's dungeon, the machinery of the Reformation is already turning his private obsession into a public sermon. The stage is set for a death that will be remembered not for the crime, but for the performance. We return to where we began, the freezing morning of February 22nd, 1563. The location is St. Andrews, the ecclesiastical capital of Scotland. It is a town of grey stone dominated by the massive cathedral and the castle that sits on a rocky promontory overlooking the North Sea. The atmosphere is not just cold, it is heavy with religious tension. St. Andrews is the stronghold of the Protestant Reformation. The people gathering in the marketplace are not the sophisticated courtiers of Holyrood. They are merchants, fishermen, and the pious followers of John Knox. They have come to see justice done to a foreigner, a French popinjay, who dared to defile their queen. Chastelard is brought out from the castle dungeon. He has spent 8 days in darkness, 8 days to think about the woman who ordered his death, 8 days to realize that his life is ending at 23. But as he emerges into the light, something is different. Most prisoners in this era are broken by the time they reach the scaffold. They are dragged, weeping, or they are catatonic with fear. Chastelard walks. He is composed. He is dressed with meticulous care. He wears velvet, the fabric of nobility, a final assertion of his status. He is not walking to his death. He is walking to his apotheosis. The most shocking moment of the day occurs before the axe is even lifted. A priest approaches him. In the 16th century, the presence of a confessor is non-negotiable. It is the final act of mercy. You confess your sins, you receive absolution, and you die with a clean soul. Chastelard waves him away. The crowd gasps. To refuse a priest is to embrace damnation. It is an act of spiritual suicide. But Chastelard is making a statement. He is declaring that his religion is not Catholicism nor Protestantism. His religion is love. He does not ask for a Bible. Instead, he pulls a small leather-bound book from his doublet. It is Les Hymnes by Pierre de Chastelard. He begins to read. He does not read a prayer. He reads a poem titled Hymn to Death, Hymne de la Mort. Ronsard wrote that death is not an end, but a release from the prison of the body. It is a return to the elements. Chastelard recites the lines with a steady voice, turning the scaffold into a stage. He looks toward the windows of the royal residence. The queen is not there. She has secluded herself, reportedly weeping, but he plays to the invisible audience. His final words are not directed to God. They are directed to Mary. He shouts, his voice carrying over the wind, Adieu, toi si belle et si cruelle, qui me tue et que je ne puis cesser d'aimer. Farewell, you who are so beautiful and so cruel, who kill me and whom I cannot cease to love. He kneels. He places his head on the block. He does not struggle. The executioner raises the axe. In one strike, the poet is silenced. But the story does not end with the fall of the blade. In fact, the real damage is just beginning. The moment Chastelard's head fell into the basket, the political machine of John Knox roared to life. Knox, the fiery leader of the Scottish Reformation, did not see a tragedy. He saw a weapon. He needed to destroy Mary's moral authority to ensure the triumph of Protestantism. Chastelard was the perfect ammunition. Knox argued a simple, brutal logic. Innocent women do not attract men into their bedrooms. He ignored the fact that Mary had resisted. He ignored the fact that she had screamed for help. He ignored the fact that she had ordered the execution. To Knox, the very fact that Chastelard existed was proof of Mary's guilt. He preached that Mary's French habits, her dancing, her music, her frivolity, were essentially foreplay. He claimed that she had allured Chastelard. He twisted the narrative so that the stalker became the victim of a siren, and the queen became the predator. This was the birth of the Whore of Babylon myth that would dog Mary for the rest of her life. It was a master class in victim blaming. Knox successfully shifted the public conversation from a man broke into the palace to the queen is running a brothel. For Mary, this was a devastating psychological blow. She realized that her gender was being used against her. She could be the most pious, dutiful ruler, but if a man projected his fantasies onto her, she would be the one punished. This brings us back to the suspicious nature of his arrival. While no smoking gun exists to prove Chastelard was a paid agent, the convenience of his intrusion remains striking. He may not have realized he was a saboteur, but his obsession weaponized him perfectly for Mary's enemies. The ease with which he gained access a second time suggests that someone in the household, perhaps a Protestant sympathizer, opened the door, literally and metaphorically, to scandal. Spies do not always leave receipts, but the efficiency with which the scandal was used by Mary's enemies suggests that his intrusion was, if not planned, certainly welcomed by those who wanted to see the queen fall. The execution of Chastelard changed Mary Stuart forever. Before 1563, she was the White Queen, young, hopeful, trying to balance her Catholicism with her Protestant subjects. She loved to dance. She loved to mask. She loved the game of courtly love. After 1563, the mask came off. She realized that her little France was not a bubble. It was a target. She stopped the open, flirtatious behavior that had characterized her early reign. She became harder. She became more suspicious. The trauma of the assault, the physical reality of a man attacking her in her shift, stayed with her. It colored her relationships with men. When she later married Lord Darnley, a disastrous match, some historians argue she was looking for a protector, a strong man who could physically guard her bedroom door. Chastelard's ghost haunted her reputation until the day she died. 24 years later, when Mary was on trial for her life in England, her accusers would drag up every scandal of her past. And at the top of the list, alongside the murder of Darnley, was the name of the French poet found under her bed. In the end, Pierre de Chastelard got what he wanted. He was immortalized. He is remembered not as a soldier, but as the man who died for love. But the cost was the destruction of the women he claimed to adore. He was the first domino in the long, tragic chain reaction that led Mary, Queen of Scots, to her own scaffold at Fotheringhay Castle. The axe has fallen, and the immediate scandal has been fed to the crowd. But as the blood is scrubbed from the scaffold, a chill descends upon the royal court. The execution of Chastelard does something far more damaging than merely ending a life. It kills the spirit of the Renaissance in Scotland. We must now look at how the little France Mary built began to dismantle itself brick by terrified brick in the wake of the poet's death. The execution of Pierre de Chastelard on February 22, 1563, did not just end a life, it ended an era. For 18 months, Mary Stuart had tried to graft the vibrant artistic culture of the French Renaissance onto the rugged rootstock of the Scottish Reformation. She had succeeded briefly. Her court at Holyrood had been a place of masks, poetry, and music. It was a little France, where the grim realities of John Knox's theology were kept at bay by the sound of the lute. But when the axe fell on Chastelard's neck, the music stopped. The psychological impact on the Queen was immediate and profound. Contemporary ambassadors reported that Mary fell into a deep melancholy. She was physically ill for days. The realization that her own playfulness, her French manners, had been weaponized against her was a bitter pill. She saw clearly, perhaps for the first time, that she was not just a ruler, she was a target. The muses of her court fell silent. The other poets and musicians looked at the empty space where Chastelard had stood and realized that their art was now dangerous. To write a sonnet to the Queen was no longer a path to patronage. It was a path to the scaffold. The atmosphere at Holyrood shifted from a salon to a fortress. The laughter died down, replaced by the hushed whispers of suspicion. Who is watching? Who is listening? Mary's behavior changed. She became more guarded. The accessibility that had charmed her subjects was replaced by a rigid formality. She realized that in Scotland, a queen could not have friends. She could only have subjects or enemies. While Mary retreated into the shadows of her palace, the ghost of Chastelard began to take on a life of its own in France. Pierre de Chastelard, the great poet who had taught Chastelard everything he knew about love and death, was devastated. He did not see his student as a criminal. He saw him as a tragic hero, a man who had flown too close to the sun. Ronsard wrote an elegy that cemented the myth of the mad lover. In his Elegy à Marie Stuart, he portrayed Chastelard not as a stalker, but as a knight of old. He wrote, "He died for having raised his eyes too high." This line became the epitaph of the entire affair. It transformed a sordid incident of intrusion and attempted assault into a noble failure. In the literary salons of Paris, Chastelard was canonized. He became the patron saint of unrequited love. Young poets would drink wine and toast to the man who died for a kiss. But this romanticization did Mary no favors. By elevating Chastelard, the French poets inadvertently validated the rumors. If he was a martyr for love, then there must have been love to die for. It kept the scandal alive in the courts of Europe long after the blood had dried in St. Andrews. It reinforced the idea that Mary was a woman who inspired fatal, destructive passions, a femme fatale whose beauty was a curse. Historians looking back at the 1560s can see a terrifying pattern emerging. Chastelard was not an isolated incident. He was the prototype. He was the first in a line of men who would become obsessed with Mary, try to control her, and ultimately destroy her reputation. 3 years later, in 1566, the pattern repeated with David Rizzio. Like Chastelard, Rizzio was a foreigner, Italian, a musician, and a favorite of the Queen. Like Chastelard, he was rumored to be her lover. And like Chastelard, he was brutally eliminated, stabbed 56 times in front of the pregnant Queen by her own husband, Lord Darnley, and his Protestant allies. Then came Lord Darnley himself. He married her, tried to seize her crown, and was murdered in a gunpowder explosion at Kirk O'Field in 1567. Then came James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell. He abducted Mary, allegedly raped her to force a marriage, and dragged her into the final ruin of her reign. Chastelard was the dress rehearsal for these tragedies. His intrusion taught Mary's enemies a crucial lesson. The Queen's vulnerability lies in her private life. It showed them that they didn't need to defeat her armies in the field. They just needed to create a scandal in her bedroom. The script that John Knox wrote in 1563, "The Queen is a whore, her favorites are her lovers," was used again and again until it finally cost Mary her head. But strictly speaking, was Chastelard merely a madman? His behavior fits the clinical definition of erotomania. He lived in a fantasy world where the Queen's polite smiles were secret vows of marriage. Or perhaps the most tragic truth is that he was a mirror. Chastelard held up a mirror to the 16th century. He showed us the clash between the medieval ideal of courtly love, where a knight serves his lady with pure devotion, and the brutal reality of Renaissance politics, where a queen is a strategic asset, not a woman. He died because he mistook the game for reality. He thought he was in a poem by Ronsard, but he was actually in a sermon by John Knox. While Mary's court retreats into fearful silence, the shock waves of the affair are moving far beyond the stone walls of Holyrood. A scandal in the 16th century is like a virus. It respects no borders. To fully grasp the catastrophe of this romantic intrusion, we must zoom out from the personal tragedy of the Queen to the grand chessboard of Europe. The real damage wasn't done in a bedroom in Fife, but in the diplomatic dispatch boxes arriving in London and Madrid. When the axe severed Pierre de Chastelard's head in St. Andrews, the blood did not just stain the wooden scaffold. It splattered across the diplomatic maps of Europe. In the 16th century, news traveled at the speed of a horse, but scandal traveled at the speed of light. The execution of a French nobleman in a Scottish market square was not a local news story. It was an international incident. To fully understand the catastrophe of the Chastelard affair, we must leave the cold winds of Scotland and travel to the whispering galleries of London, Paris, and Madrid. We must open the dispatch boxes of the ambassadors, the spies in velvet, who were watching Mary's every move. What we find there is that Chastelard's death was not just a tragedy of love, it was the event that likely cost Mary the crown of 3 kingdoms. Our most vital witness to the aftermath is not a Scot, but an Englishman, Thomas Randolph. Randolph was Queen Elizabeth I's ambassador to Scotland. In reality, he was her spy master. His job was to charm Mary, drink with her lords, and report every weakness back to William Cecil in London. Randolph's letters from February and March 1563 are fascinating. He does not write about the romance. He writes about the political opportunity. On the very day of the execution, he penned a report that was cold, clinical, and devastating. He described the execution not as justice, but as a symptom of a diseased court. He wrote to Cecil, "The Queen is sad, but I know not for whom, whether for the man who died or for the shame that lives." Randolph skillfully leveraged this contrast to his advantage. He understood that Elizabeth I cultivated her virgin queen persona as untouchable, wise and chaste in public perception, while portraying Mary as entangled in tumultuous emotions and scandals. He reported the details of the La Volta dance. He reported the familiarity Mary had shown the poet. These letters were read in the English court, confirming the English prejudices against Mary. They solidified the view that Mary Stuart was too French, a code word for morally loose, to ever be trusted with the English succession. Randolph effectively used Chastelard's corpse to build a wall between Mary and the English throne. But the damage in London was nothing compared to the disaster in Madrid. In 1563, Mary was the most eligible widow in Europe. The great game of the era was to marry her off to a superpower. The leading candidate was Don Carlos, the son of Philip II of Spain. This match would have been a game changer. A union between Scotland and the Spanish Empire would have created a Catholic superpower that could have crushed Protestant England. Philip II was seriously considering it. Negotiations were secret, delicate, and advanced. Then came the news of Chastelard. The Spanish court was the most rigid, formal, and conservative in Europe. The etiquette there was so strict that touching the Queen of Spain was punishable by death. When the Spanish ambassador in London heard the rumors that a man had been found twice in Mary's bedroom and that she had danced the lascivious La Volta with him, he was horrified. Philip II was a man who valued dignity above all else. He reportedly read the dispatches and cooled immediately on the idea. He could not have his son marry a woman who was the subject of such sordid gossip. The Spanish marriage evaporated. Historians often overlook this, but Chastelard's intrusion likely changed the map of the world. If Mary had married Don Carlos, the Spanish Armada might have launched from Leith instead of Lisbon. There might have been no Protestant England. Chastelard, in his madness, saved Elizabeth I from her most dangerous geopolitical threat. One would expect the French court to be furious. A French subject, a nobleman with connections to the Bayard family, had been beheaded in Scotland without a trial by his peers. Normally, this would be a cause for war, or at least a severe diplomatic protest. Instead, silence. To understand why, we must look at the woman sitting on the throne of France, Catherine de' Medici. Catherine was the Queen Mother of France. She was Mary's mother-in-law, and she hated Mary with a passion that was almost biological. During Mary's time in France, the young, beautiful Scots queen had famously called Catherine a merchant's daughter, referring to her non-royal Medici banking roots. Catherine never forgot a slight. When news arrived that Mary's reputation was in tatters because of a French poet, Catherine was likely delighted. She did not send a letter of protest. She did not demand an explanation for Chastelard's death. She viewed it as Mary's just deserts. Furthermore, Catherine was in the middle of a delicate balancing act between Catholics and Huguenots in France. The First War of Religion had just ended. She had no desire to defend a Huguenot poet, Chastelard, or to help her Catholic rival, Mary. She let the scandal burn. This was a crucial lesson for Mary. She was alone. Her little France was an illusion. The real France, the France of Catherine de' Medici, would not lift a finger to save her dignity. Legally, the trial of Chastelard set a dark precedent in Scottish law. Before this case, treason was usually defined as an act against the king's life or authority. Rebellion, assassination, counterfeiting coin. Chastelard was executed for an act against the queen's virtue. The charge was constructed around the idea that violating the royal privacy was equal to violating the royal person. This blurred the line between the queen's two bodies, the body politic, the state, and the body natural, the woman. By framing her personal privacy as a national security concern, Mary unintentionally allowed governmental oversight to become a permanent fixture in her private life, setting a precedent that her intimate affairs were of public and state significance. This legal framework would be used against her with lethal efficiency 4 years later. When her second husband, Lord Darnley, was murdered, the investigation focused entirely on her passions. The casket letters, the disputed documents used to condemn her, were essentially a sequel to the Chastelard poems. They were used to prove that she was a woman ruled by lust, not law. Chastelard was the test case. The prosecutors learned that they could destroy a queen by putting her heart on trial. We fast forward 24 years to the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle. It is 1587. Mary is on trial for her life, accused of plotting to assassinate Elizabeth I, the Babington plot. During the proceedings, the prosecutors did not just stick to the assassination plot. They attacked her character. They needed to prove that she was a woman capable of murder. To do that, they had to prove she was immoral. The Chastelard affair was dragged out of the archives. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's new spy master, used the old rumors. He painted a picture of a woman who had been scandalous from her youth. The name Chastelard was whispered alongside Rizzio and Bothwell as proof of a pattern of depravity. Even in her final days, Mary could not escape the shadow of the man who had hidden under her bed. The glitch in the matrix of 1563 had become a permanent stain on her record. When Mary walked to her own execution, wearing crimson, the Catholic color of martyrdom, she was trying to rewrite the story one last time. She was trying to die as a queen, not as the whore of Babylon that John Knox and Thomas Randolph had created out of the Chastelard scandal. But as the axe fell on her neck, the history books were already written. The poet had written the first chapter of her tragedy, and the politicians had written the rest. Yet, one nagging question remains buried in the archives. In the inventory of Mary's possessions, taken years later, there is a mention of a small book of poems by Ronsard. It was well worn. It was kept in her private cabinet. Was this the book Chastelard held on the scaffold? Did she keep it? If she did, it changes the story yet again. It suggests that despite the terror, despite the ruin he brought upon her, Mary Stuart could not entirely hate the man who died for her. It suggests that in the cold, hard world of 16th century politics, she held on to a fragment of the romance that destroyed her. It is the final paradox. The man who ruined her reputation was perhaps the only man who truly loved her. Not for her crown, not for her alliance, but for herself. And for that crime, he had to die. We have seen how the politicians weaponized the scandal to redraw the map of Europe. But to understand the root of this madness, we have to stop looking at the treaties and start looking at the texts. This was a tragedy scripted in ink before it was written in blood. We need to open the black box of this disaster, the poems themselves, to see if they reveal a man who was driven by madness or a queen who was guilty of a fatal literary mistake. In modern criminal investigations, detectives look for digital footprints, texts, emails, GPS data. In the 16th century, the soul left a different kind of trail, ink. To understand the Chastelard affair fully, we cannot just look at the political fallout or the physical movements of the court. We must look at the words. This was, after all, a tragedy scripted by poets. Both the victim and the accused were writers. They communicated in sonnets, relied on metaphors, and lived their lives according to the strict, often fatal, rules of Renaissance literature. If we treat the poems of 1562 to 1563 as evidence, as the black box of this disaster, what do they reveal? Do they show a queen flirting with danger or a man descending into madness? We know that Pierre de Chastelard was a disciple of Pierre de Ronsard. This is not just a biographical detail, it is the key to his psychology. Ronsard's poetry was obsessed with the connection between eros, love, and thanatos, death. When investigators raided Chastelard's quarters in St. Andrews after his arrest, they didn't find maps of Scottish fortresses or letters from spy masters. They found poems. The surviving fragments and the descriptions of his work give us a terrifying glimpse into his mind. These were not the polite formulaic verses of a courtier complimenting a queen's beauty. They were raw. They were violent. One reported sonnet speaks of a love that burns the veins and turns the blood to ash. Another uses the metaphor of a moth drawn to a candle, a cliche now, but in the 16th century, a powerful image of self-destruction. Chastelard wrote about the pleasure of dying for a mistress. He didn't want a happy ending. He wanted a tragic ending. This reinterpretation shifts our view of Chastelard's stalking from a modern possessive obsession to a self-destructive desire for annihilation by his idolized victim, Mary. Unlike contemporary stalkers seeking control or intimacy, his bedroom intrusion appears less about physical conquest and more about orchestrating a dramatic finale in his personal narrative, a scripted tragedy where he casts himself as the doomed lover and compels Mary to embody the archetypal cruel mistress, ultimately decreeing his execution to fulfill the poetic climax he envisioned. Here is where the investigation enters its murkiest waters. Did Mary, Queen of Scots, encourage him? John Knox and the English spies claimed she did. They pointed to the literary exchanges. It is a historical fact that Mary was a poet. She wrote in French, her mother tongue. She enjoyed the intellectual challenge of beaux rimes, rhymed bouts, a game where one person provides the rhymes and the other must construct a poem around them. Critics argue that by engaging in this game with Chastelard, Mary lowered the drawbridge. She allowed a subject to speak to her as an equal within the confines of the poem. There is a controversial theory that some of the poems later attributed to Mary, specifically the early sonnets in the casket letters, the disputed documents found later, were actually written during this period. These poems speak of a forbidden love and a sacrifice of honor. If Mary wrote lines like, "For him I would leave my honor and my conscience" in 1562, she was handing Chastelard a loaded gun. However, defenders of the Queen argue that this is a misreading of Renaissance culture. In the 1560s, queens were expected to be the center of literary circles. Elizabeth I of England also received passionate, borderline erotic poems from her courtiers, most notably Sir Walter Raleigh and Robert Dudley. The difference was that Elizabeth's courtiers knew it was a metaphor. Chastelard, the fanatic, thought it was literal. This disconnect is not without parallel in history. Consider the English court of Henry VIII, just a generation prior. Sir Thomas Wyatt, a poet and courtier, wrote dangerous verses about Anne Boleyn, referring to her as Caesar's property. Wyatt narrowly escaped the scaffold because he knew when to stop playing the game. Chastelard did not. Mary's crime in this light was not promiscuity. It was a failure of literary criticism. She didn't realize that her partner was reading a different genre. The story of Chastelard did not die in 1563. It lay dormant for centuries until it was dug up by the Victorians. In 1865, Algernon Charles Swinburne published his verse drama Chastelard. A bold and unconventional poet of the Victorian era, Swinburne was fascinated by themes of intense passion and tragic desire, and he found in the historical Chastelard affair the perfect subject for his artistic vision. Swinburne's play is important because it defined how the English-speaking world saw Mary for the next 100 years. In his version, Chastelard is the hero, and Mary is a cold, heartless femme fatale who enjoys watching men die for her. Swinburne invents a scene where Mary visits Chastelard in his cell before the execution. It never happened, but it feels emotionally true to the myth. In the play, Mary is shown as a woman who loves the idea of love but is incapable of human feeling. This fictional version of Mary, the Siren of the North, bled into the history books. It reinforced the stereotype that female rulers were inherently manipulative. When we watch movies or TV shows today, like the recent series Reign, We are often watching Swinburne's Mary, not the historical Mary. We are watching a character created by a 19th century poet to satisfy a Victorian fantasy about dangerous women. If the Victorians made it a tragedy, Hollywood made it a soap opera. In almost every film adaptation of Mary's life, Chastelard appears, but he is almost always cleaned up. He is portrayed as a handsome, misunderstood romantic lead. The films usually cut the most disturbing part of the story, the second intrusion at Ross End Castle. Why? Because showing a man hiding under a woman's bed and attacking her while she is undressing is not romantic. It is terrifying. It makes the audience uncomfortable. It makes Chastelard a villain. By softening the edges of the story, pop culture has done a disservice to the reality of Mary's trauma. The films show her weeping for him. In reality, the records show she screamed for her brother to stab him. The screenwriters want a Romeo and Juliet story. History gives us a Cape Fear story. This distortion matters. It minimizes the danger Mary was in. It supports the tragic romance narrative that obscures the political assassination attempt that was hiding behind the poetry. There is one final mystery to examine in this literary autopsy. Where is the body? Pierre de Chastelard was beheaded in St. Andrews. Usually the bodies of traitors were quartered and displayed on the city gates as a warning. The heads were spiked on the toll booth in Edinburgh. But there is no record of Chastelard's head being spiked. There is no record of his quarters being sent to the four corners of the kingdom. Some sources suggest he was buried in the precincts of St. Andrew's Cathedral, in unconsecrated ground. Others suggest his body was quietly shipped back to France by his grieving family. This absence of a grave contributed to his ghost status. Because there was no physical monument, he became a creature of pure story. He became a legend. For Mary, this was the worst possible outcome. A grave is a finite thing. You can walk past it and say, he is there. A legend is infinite. It follows you. It changes shape. By vanishing into the mist, Chastelard ensured that he would never truly leave Mary's side. He became the invisible third person in her marriages, the shadow in her courtroom, and finally the precedent in her own trial. In the end, the ink proved more durable than the blood. The poems survived. The Queen did not. The evidence has been laid out. The political fallout, the psychological profile, and the literary trail. But this does not merely close the case. It opens a window into the machinery of Mary's downfall. We have walked through the snow of St. Andrews. We have stood in the Queen's bedchamber. We have read the dispatches of spies. Now we must attempt to answer the question that has hung over this case for centuries. Did the ghost of this poet actually kill the Queen? It sounds like a metaphor, but in the ruthless world of 16th century politics, metaphors have a nasty habit of becoming legal arguments. The evidence suggests that the Chastelard affair was not just a scandalous prelude to Mary's reign, it was the blueprint for her destruction. To understand the true blast radius of Chastelard's actions, we must fast forward to 1567, 4 years after his head rolled. Mary is deposed. Her enemies, led by her half-brother Moray, the man who saved Chastelard from immediate death only to execute him later, need to justify locking her up. They produce a silver casket. Inside, they claim, are love letters and sonnets written by Mary to her third husband, Lord Bothwell, proving she plotted to kill her second husband, Lord Darnley. These are the infamous casket letters. Their authenticity is the greatest whodunit in Scottish history. But here is where the Chastelard connection becomes explosive. Modern linguistic analysis and historical theories suggest that the sonnets found in the casket, passionate, desperate, French verses about forbidden love, bear a striking resemblance to the style of the early courtly games Mary played with Chastelard. The theory: did the forgers, Mary's enemies, use old poems? Did they take innocent verses Mary had written during the poetic duels of 1562, verses meant as intellectual exercises with Chastelard, and repurpose them? If this theory holds, it means Chastelard's influence was even more toxic than we thought. It means the very words Mary wrote to amuse her mad poet were twisted years later into the evidence that cost her the throne. The game of courtly love became the evidence of adultery and murder. Chastelard provided the raw material for the frame-up. We must also pass a final medical verdict on the man himself. Was Pierre de Chastelard mad in the legal sense? Modern forensic psychiatrists would likely diagnose Chastelard with de Clerambault's syndrome, a delusional conviction that a high-status figure is secretly in love with them. In his mind, rejection was merely a test of devotion, and he was not a villain, but the protagonist of a tragic romance. He lived in a reality entirely of his own making, misinterpreting every signal. Mary's fatal error lay in treating this clinical delusion as mere social awkwardness. She applied the polite rules of the French salon to a situation that required the strict constraints of an asylum. By the time she recognized the true danger, the boundary had been crossed and the scandal was irrevocable. Historians suggest that without this intrusion, the course of history might have shifted dramatically. The negotiations for a Spanish marriage could have proceeded, potentially creating a Catholic superpower that encircled England. Chastelard, a minor poet with a major delusion, acted as a butterfly effect, inadvertently saving Protestant England not with a sword, but with a scandal. The execution at St. Andrews marked the definitive death of Mary Stuart's youth. The White Queen, optimistic and culturally vibrant, vanished that day, replaced by a hardened monarch, forced to defend her virtue against a suspicious world. The executioner's axe did not just kill a man, it severed the possibility of a little France in Scotland forever.